Can I just say we've got a really interesting talk now with Elisabeth, who we're going to Teams in.
Right, everybody. Thank you for attending this next session. Hi, Elisabeth. You okay? So I'm going to hand over to Elisabeth van Delden, who is part of the Make the Label Count movement, and she'll explain about measuring sustainability in fashion and some of the upcoming legislation.
Thank you for the introductions. I hope you can all hear me well. Otherwise, let me know. I'm really honored to speak to all of you today. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. I'm actually based in Germany, where it's quite getting already dark, gloomy, and it's rainy. But my colleagues Rebecca and Louise, who are probably also in the room, already sent me pictures from your beautiful event, and it looked really good. So I'm sure you're having a wonderful time. And I hope I can contribute to some extent to a good time today. I'll cover over the next 20 minutes measuring sustainability in the sense of I'll explain what is the product environmental footprint, or in short PEF, which you may have already heard. What are the shortfalls and why does it matter if it's written into legislation? And also, of course, what Make the Label Count is doing about it. So we all know fashion has a huge environmental footprint, and in the last 15 years, clothing production has actually doubled. And as you can see here in the graph, the growth is almost entirely driven by synthetics, and the onset of fast fashion has been pretty much built on cheap fossil fuel fibers. And many countries are starting to look to regulate the fashion industry, and the EU is, of course, at the forefront of it all. But if we all know that we need to reduce our impact, then we also need to be able to first measure what our impact is. And this, of course, raises the obvious question, like how do we measure impact fairly and consistently? And especially in textiles, where we have so many different fibers, we have so many different origins, we have a very complex supply chain, a very long supply chain, especially in wool. So it's, of course, a real challenge on how to measure the impact of our industry. And the EU actually had a go at it already starting back in 2013. It started developing the product environmental footprint. And the goal also was really to create a harmonized, consistent method that could apply to all different products. So not just textiles, but actually also washing machines and tires and batteries, etc. And it uses these, or it measures these 16 different impact categories that you see here on this chart. So things like climate change, land use, water scarcity, and it turns all of these then into one single score. And this product environmental footprint then can also be applied to the category of apparel and footwear. So you have this overarching methodology, and that then gets adapted to different sectors. So there's a product environmental footprint category rules for apparel and footwear, but there's also one for cosmetics, dairy, cut flowers, fertilizers, dishwasher, taps, etc. And these category rules is then the methodology that a company that produces garments would use to calculate the footprint of a product. So they would do a PEF study on a sweater or a t-shirt and feed it with life cycle assessment data. So the methodology would get fed life cycle assessment data, and at the end of the exercise you get a single PEF score. And these PEF category rules for apparel and textiles actually have been developed by the industry, so not the European Commission or itself, but an industry group called the Technical Secretariat, and it was a group that you see here the members of, and there was a distinguishment between voting members and non-voting members, and the thing was that in order to be a voting member, you had to also pay a fee. It was kind of a pay-to-play model. So many of the decisions were done by those voting members that you see here. So this sounds all very abstract. So let me give you a more concrete example of how the path works for a product. So here you see a 100% wool sweater from the brand Devold. The wool in the sweater is sourced from Norway and produced, I think probably washed in the UK. And then the whole manufacturing has been done in Lithuania. And the sweater has a certification of the Nordic Swan, so one of the highest certifications for sustainability that a product can achieve in the EU. And we also purchased a 100% polyester sweater from Shein, and this one was produced in China. And we put the numbers into the path, and we got a score that the wool sweater is worse for the environment than the 100% polyester sweater. And I hope that when you see these kind of results, that you get this feeling that this can't be right. Why is a wool sweater produced in Europe worse for the environment than a polyester sweater that comes from overseas? And it doesn't really matter if it's a sweater from Shein or any other brand, or it could be also a cotton sweater. The results would be pretty similar, that the synthetic product would have a better environmental score than a natural fiber one. And most of the impacts are actually seen for the natural fiber one, the wool one, in the production of the fibers. So if you don't mind, I'll try to make you two small or mini LCA experts over the next 10 minutes. So I'll try to explain why such a result is possible with PEP. So kind of what is going wrong in the methodology. So the first obvious gap is that none of the 16 PEP categories addresses the impacts of synthetics. And these are plastic waste and microplastics. So if microfiber shedding, for example, isn't measured as an impact, it doesn't affect the single score at the end. So there is the requirement in PEP for apparel and footwear to give information about microfiber shedding. So you have to identify how many microfibers the product releases during washing. So it's actually just a very tiny bit of this life cycle that gets measured. And the whole, we know that garments shed microfibers or microplastics throughout its entire life, so already during manufacturing and end of life. But all of this information isn't included or does not need to be reported. But still, in the end, none of this actually ends up in the single score. It's not accounted for. It just needs to be given as an information. So if such an impact for synthetics is totally ignored, of course, the synthetic garment would look better on paper than the natural fiber one. Another flaw in PEP is that biodegradability is hardly recognized in the PEP score. So there is some calculation for biodegradability, but if you actually compare the product of including biodegradability and not including it, you see here the score hardly changes. So there's no reward for choosing natural fibers that biodegrade. It hardly affects the score. So this is, again, kind of a bias against natural fibers and favors synthetic garments. Another big issue is what we call the system boundary problem. So when you run an LCA, you have to decide what is included in your study and what is not included. And for natural fibers, you see here the system boundary is set really from the farm up to end of life. So obviously we also account for any environmental impacts that happen on farm and then along the whole supply chain. But obviously synthetics coming from crude oil have a very different supply chain, and the system boundary therefore is different. So you're comparing agriculturally farmed products with mined products. So you're not actually comparing pears and apples, you're comparing apples with plastic apples. So totally different systems and totally different ecosystems. So it's hard to actually compare them equally. And there's even guidance from ISO SCA guidelines that you shouldn't compare products when they don't have the same system boundary. But yet in a tool such as PEF, this obviously happens. And I can also understand that brands would want to compare synthetic and natural fiber in a garment when they make sourcing decisions. But it is, again, a disadvantage for natural fibers to have a very different system boundary. And this one, the land use, is another good example of this. So you remember that the land use was, the farm stage is included for natural fibers. And obviously, sheep need land. That's simply how nature works. But in PEF, using more land automatically leads to a higher score. So it's a bad thing. Farmers get penalized for running sheep on big paddocks, even though we know that extensive grazing is actually much better for ecosystems instead of intensive grazing on very small areas of land. But this gets penalized. And of course, I had to put in like an oil rig in here because obviously oil rigs use hardly any land, or also a polyester mill wouldn't use much land. But just due to the nature that natural fibers get produced on land, it is a penalty in PEF. And this also leads to the other aspect that we know that grazing can have very positive contributions for our planet. So sheep graze when they're farmed very sustainably, and they can improve soil health, biodiversity, improve water cycles, sequester carbon in the soil. But as land is just considered as something negative, none of these positive benefits are taken into account. So we're just looking at everything negative. We're not accounting for any of the positive benefits that natural fibers, including sheep and wool, have for our planet. So again, there's a bias towards for synthetics, and that's why natural fibers, and in this case wool, scores badly. Another very important law in PEF is garment lifetime. So, and this is actually the most influential factor in the whole PEF model, because at the end, all impacts that are calculated get divided by the assumed number of wears. So if you just wear something once and then toss it, obviously that's a bigger impact than if you wear something 100 times. It has a much lower impact. And of course, like thinking of a wedding dress, you just use it once, hopefully, and then that's obviously a big environmental cost for something that you've just used once. So this makes sense. The problem then is, how do you estimate how long someone will wear and use a product? So the technical secretariat developed this table where it defined how many times certain product categories would be worn. So let's just take like the category 4, jackets and coats. So the assumption is that jackets and coats, irrelevant of what fiber is in it, will get worn 100 times. So 100 times in Europe, that's one season, so one winter. So we would assume that every wool coat that we buy, or that we would just wear it for one season. But I would argue that many of you came with a nice wool coat today and you've had it for many years and you'll continue to have it. But maybe that really fancy Christmas blouse made out of polyester, you've just bought it for fun, for one time wearing it, and you might not wear it that much often again. So here it's very critical that there's no distinguishing between fibers and that there's just this one number that is not even, that is just kind of based on experts' knowledge, that is such an important factor. And there is the opportunity to do physical durability testing or develop a durability multiplier, so you can increase the assumed garment lifetime by doing physical durability or physical tests. And one of them, for example, is fiber strength test, where you just pull the fiber apart and look when it breaks. And you can see here that for wool, it actually breaks quite quickly when you pull it apart like that. But wool, as you would know, is still a very durable fiber. It can last for years, but that's not because of its physical strength, but because of its elasticity. It can always go back into its form. So, but this kind of elasticity test is not included as an option for physical testing. So again, wool loses out in this physical durability test, and it would always be perceived as not a durable fiber. And so the garment lifetime will always be lower. And this kind of thinking makes sense, again, for tires and washing machines. So the thinking is kind of the tougher the garment, the longer it will be used. And of course, we don't throw away our dishwasher. We will only throw it away once it's really broken down. But with clothing, it's a totally different category. We throw away our garments when our body changes. We get rid of our garments when we no longer like the color or the style goes out of fashion. So the reasons why we dispose of our clothes is not physical durability. It's only 1/3 of the time where something actually breaks down. And you also need to, obviously we all know that our closets are full because we accumulate, so we don't necessarily replace garments because they're no longer good. We also accumulate and overconsume. So none of this is taken into account, and that we think is quite dangerous if we really want to address some of the environmental issues of our industry. And then there's also life cycle data. So that was the second part. The methodology is one part, as I said, and the other one is the actual data that you feed into it. And what we found out is actually the EU supplies LCA data to be used, but what we found when looking at it, that it was very, very bad quality. So it was sourced from grey literature, it came from a meat sheep farm in New Zealand that had nothing to do with wool for apparel, and the way it was developed was very opaque. And so we did supply the European Commission with an updated wool LCA data set that was more representative, and it actually lowered our score and passed by 6 times. We still think it's not yet where it should be because the methodology is poor, so it would actually improve even more if some of those methodological issues were addressed. So we're working on that. Obviously, we're constantly updating our LCA data sets. There will be a new one coming out in the new year. So also if any of you in the room are interested in getting access to these LCA data sets, do get in touch because we can supply you with that data. But it also has been accepted by the EU. So the next question is, now we know that we have a methodology that has a lot of flaws, and we have this very strange result. But what is actually going to happen with this kind of a tool and with this kind of result? And this is where it's also important to understand that PEF is not a regulation or legislation. It's just a tool to measure something. the issue is then, how does this tool get applied or incorporated into legislation? So let's have a look at that next. So PEF actually gets mentioned in two legislations that the EU has been working on. One is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, which you probably refer to as ESPR. And ESPR is the one that also includes the Digital Product Passport. That regulation is already the law, and it is now being implemented for textiles. So the European Commission is currently working on applying this very broad regulation framework that applies, again, to all products that are out there, and trying to adapt it specifically for textiles, because textiles is a priority for the European Commission. And here, PEF is written and mentioned in the law itself, and it's mentioned in order to feed into performance requirements and also provide data for the Digital Product Passport, environmental data. So you see the problem that if we have a bad score and we have to then display it on the Digital Product Passport, that can be an issue. And also if it starts to inform how we design, what materials we choose, it will again be an issue. The other one where PEF is mentioned is the Green Claims Directive. Those of you who are following this closely know that it is currently on hold. We know that tomorrow the Danish presidency, who's currently the presidency of the European Council, is going to discuss if and how they can revive it and get it approved. But for the moment, there's a lot of resistance against the Green Claims Directive. However, it does mention PEF, and it mentions PEF in order to substantiate green claims. So that would mean if you want to say this product is sustainable, you would have to use a tool. You can use other tools as well, but one of them that are mentioned is PEF, and it's not clear what the other tools would be. That if you want to make a green claim on your product and say this product is in any way sustainable or has a low carbon footprint, you should use PEF. So then again, you can see where that would lead, that a product could be easily greenwashed if you use recycled polyester, because recycled polyester, according to PEF, is the most sustainable fiber you can use in those terms. And it could actually mean that wool products could face challenges in saying that we are a sustainable product. So we're watching this space closely. And obviously, the consequences are quite severe. So if you have a flawed tool, it will also lead to flawed policy outcomes. So what do I mean with that? If PEF is applied as it is currently intended, and it's not, everything is still a little bit in flow and being developed, so we don't have everything how it's going to play out. But it would impact how brands make sourcing decisions, make design decisions. And this will obviously impact immediately all the rural communities that depend on the production of natural fibers. It would also mean heavy burdens for SMEs and the rest of the supply chain, because you need to do all these calculations, you need to have more data, etc. And we think it also would be quite confusing for consumers, because as you saw with the Devolt sweater, it had the Nordic Swan label, one of the highest certifications for sustainability in Europe. But then at the same time, PEF would tell you, the consumer, oh, this product is actually bad for the environment. So what should they believe? And also being told as a consumer, oh, a natural product is actually worse for the environment than a synthetic one. We think that also is kind of counterintuitive for consumers to understand. And for the moment, the Commission actually acknowledged this, and it's not allowed for the moment to communicate a single score on a product. It's also not mandatory at the moment, but if a brand would want to use PEF and use it in any form towards consumer on the label, it's not allowed. You can use it for the moment internally for making sourcing decisions or doing reporting, but you can't use it towards a consumer at the moment. But we also think that if the EU proceeds as it's intended at the moment with PEF and the legislation, it will actually failed to achieve many of its goals. It's trying to reduce fast fashion. We don't think that it will succeed with that. It wants to address microplastics, but microplastics don't get accounted for. And it is trying to reduce the dependency on fossil fuels. But for the moment, PATH would actually encourage the usage of more polyester and other synthetic fibers. And then, of course, also the EU has a lot of international agreements, for example, on biodiversity, but also has set a lot of ambitious goals on soil health or the bioeconomy. So we think there's a mismatch of what's happening in this legislative environmental product level stage and all the other goals that the EU is trying to achieve. And of course, it would actually be a tremendous negative impact for an industry like the wool industry. So that's why we created Make the Label Count already back in 2021. And we tried to raise awareness about these flaws and really push for fairer and science-based systems. And Make the Label Count is a coalition of 80 organizations, and they're all really committed to improving the PATH method and having a fair legislation. And we have a very strong membership from the UK, which we're very thankful for. So since 2021, we've engaged extensively with EU policymakers, and our message is really clear. We're saying don't use PATH for textiles. PATH in general, we don't care, but for textiles, it's not the right tool, and it should only be used if it's heavily improved. And of course, we're also trying to provide solutions where possible. So since the campaign started, we've held over 82 meetings with individual policymakers. We drafted amendments across many legislative files. We published science-based white papers, organized events, and obviously also inform at events like these. And the way we work is because the space in Brussels, in the Brussels bubbles, is quite complex, because on the one hand, it's very technical, like I explained about LCA and the methodologies, but it's also, of course, quite political, and there's also a lot of public pressure. So it's a very complex space to work in. And in order to navigate that space in the best way, we have the strategy that we call inside the tent and outside the tent. So inside the tent is the technical engagement. So we do have LCA experts and other research and scientists who engage in technical committees that the Commission has set up in order to develop PATH. So we engage on a very research science-based way, and also whenever there's a public consultation, we provide even more evidence of where PATH fails and falls short. But then, of course, we also have this outside the tent, where we engage with the wider ecosystem of policy development. So we engage with NGOs, with other industry voices, with media, and of course directly with policymakers from the Parliament, the Council and the Commission, and really keep the pressure on. We have conversations, we do a lot of education about the textile industry, because obviously policymakers want to create the best legislation possible, but they often might not know all the details of how our industry works. So there's a lot of education involved of how things interact with each other and what the consequences would be of such a tool. So it's really, this game of political and technical engagement. And that's what really gives us a good chance of making progress. And we have made a lot of progress. So we are, as a campaign, recognized as being data-driven and solution-focused. So we're not just moaning and being critical. We're also trying to position ourselves as proactive and solution-oriented. A lot of times, policymakers contact us for some opinions or some information. We also really saw over that lifetime of the campaign that we were able to reframe the debate So we really made clear that sustainability can't just be reduced to a single metric and ignore these major impacts such as microplastics, plastic waste, not account for renewability, biodegradability, etc. And we saw really a shift in how the policymakers and the industry also thinks about environmental assessment. And we sometimes hear, we were set to go and implement all of this PEF and legislation quite quickly, but also the time frame has extended and extended because they did realize, no, they have to get this right and take it slower. So we think that's a good progress that there is some listening and an acknowledgement that natural fibers are not accounted for correctly in this. And yeah, the biggest success is that the European Commission is now reviewing the PEF methodology, and it's doing it right now over the last couple of months. And it has included on the agenda to include things like microplastics, biodiversity, circularity. And that's one point I'll talk just on one of my last slides briefly. So yes, so you remember these 16 impact categories that I had in the beginning of my presentation that's supposed to measure environmental impact. And I had also alluded that there's impacts missing. So right now, there's a technical advisory board that is reviewing these 16 methods and is trying to see how it can include microplastics, a better circularity score, allow for biodiversity, soil organic carbon, and a few others. So this is a really big chance for us to also engage in this technical discussion, and we are, contributing and providing feedback to this technical process. And of course, we don't know how successful this technical advisory board will be in including all of these missing impacts and improving PEF as much as possible. But at least there is this moment in time at the moment where change is possible. So yeah, I don't know if you'll invite me back, but then I can hopefully report that something has been improved. And at the same time, of course, we're going to also let the Commission be accountable for what they promised and that they cannot just continue as is. There needs to be change. But then I leave you with this question. So can we ever really fix LCA-based systems like PEF? Maybe a little, partly, but and there is this opportunity to close some of those gaps. But we also need to be, realistic that life cycle assessment, which is the basis of all of PEF, has never been designed to capture living and regenerative systems. It was originally designed for industrial processes. So I tried to put this together in this image that, you can develop a methodology that measures every tree, but you can never measure the entire forest and the whole ecosystem of the forest. And even if we try to add things to the ruler and make it bigger or something, it will still not actually be able to capture the forest or industry, capture everything surrounding sheep and pastures and agriculture. So that's also where I think we need to have discussions of how else can we account for all that is part of our industry and not just rely on one single tool that has never actually been designed to do what we're asking it to do. So that's what I wanted to close with. I do want to thank British Wool, the Campaign for Wool, and many of the exporters, processors, spinners, and weavers in the UK who have been very strong supporters of the campaign. We also have a few brands who have joined us, so this has been very good for us as a campaign, because obviously the bigger we are, the bigger our voices is. So that's my first call to action. If any of you in the room are interested in joining the campaign, you are welcome to reach out and join. Joining is for free, so we would appreciate. And the other call to action is if any of you have done PEF studies and you also see that the tool isn't working and is not delivering showing the true environmental impact that you think your products should deliver, then do reach out and share them with us if you're willing, because we want to show the Commission that industry is now getting test results that are burdensome, that are costly, but also are not just measuring not correctly. So if you happen to have these case studies that you want to share with us, we would also be very thankful. And otherwise, thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to also answer some questions if you want.
Thank you, Elisabeth. That was really interesting. I think just to reiterate, the work that Make the Label Count and the IWTO are doing on this is so important. If this hadn't been the case, this legislation could quite easily have been passed, and the ramifications for wool and all natural fibres would have been an absolute nightmare. So this is really, really important work that Elisabeth and the team are doing. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions because we're running a bit behind schedule, but has anybody in the audience got any questions?
Thank you. Hi, Elisabeth. Thank you for the great presentation. I'm Brooke Roberts-Islam. I write for Forbes in Business of Fashion. I wonder if you could update us on the likelihood of whether the PEF will be used within the digital product passport as the footprinting tool, and what the consequences either way of that will be.
Yeah, we don't know at the moment because the Commission is working on the secondary legislation for textiles, and they're going to publish their next milestone, they call it, I think in December or early next year. And only then we'll have a little bit more clarity. But for the moment, I mean, ESPR is already an enforced regulation, and it mentions PEF and the digital product passport. So there will be some role there. We don't know if for textiles there will be some form of exemption, or if only it gets improved. So there's a lot of uncertainties for the moment. I'm hoping for the best, but I don't know. And the consequences of either or, I mean, the consequences, if it's included, obviously, I alluded to that, it would mean, I think it would mean that brands would change sourcing away from natural fibers towards more synthetics. And that would, of course, have a very sad outcome for farmers around the world. If it's not used, I guess then we're a little bit stuck of how to provide environmental information. Would it be through certifications, or that would be, yeah. And I mean, that's one of the options, I think, that you could use PEF, or you could also use certifications. So then it would probably fall back on certifications.
Thank you.
Any more? We've got a chance for one more question if anybody's... Yep.
Oh, hi, Elisabeth. Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I'm Harriet. I'm a textiles researcher. My concern with PEF is that they're working towards the wrong life cycle assessment, because my understanding is they're working towards a cradle-to-grave life cycle assessment rather than cradle-to-cradle, which is obviously the most holistic approach. And then if you've got people like Inditex and H&M as secretariats, then surely they're always going to make it work to their advantage and push synthetics in the industry, no matter how hard you're trying to support natural fibres.
Yeah, and that's obviously the issue that we have with it. I mean, most of our members are from the natural fibers industry, so that's of course the big danger that we see, that it will just continue business as usual. That fast fashion can just claim, according to PEF, this is all very sustainable. So that's exactly what we're criticizing as well, of course.
Great. Well, thanks again, Elisabeth. That was excellent. And we can move on. Thank you. Thanks, Elisabeth.
And we didn't even mention France and Italy, but we'll do that next time.
Thanks, Elisabeth.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good rest of your afternoon.